Sir John Major obviously does not need an introduction, even to as an international audience as we have with us here today. But Sir John, apart from having been Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1990 to 1997, having held some very important positions in Cabinet, as everyone here will know beforehand, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Foreign Secretary, is also, most importantly, a President of Chatham House and Chairman of our panel of senior advisors. And I've had the very great pleasure of getting to know him over many years now. Also importantly, and you can go to our website at chathamhouse.org, you will see an interview that we did as part of the preparations for the Chatham House Centenary in 2020. We were able to have a wide-ranging conversation, and we may end up touching on some of the same topics today, Sir John. But what we've got is a good 40 minutes to be able to have a bit of a conversation. And then, obviously, I want to draw all of you in to be able to pose some questions or raise some ideas with Sir John as we go forward. So, again, Sir John, thank you very much for taking the time here. I don't know what you made of that first set of word clouds and comments that came out about transparency, credibility, equality, mutual trust. But if I could just start with a sort of scene-setting question that's in the context of this year's conference, and the kind of era of global competition we've entered in. I mean, do you think, from your vantage point, that the Western-led system of global governance that we've all lived in pretty much for the last 70 years is terminally in decline, over? Does it matter? What do you think?
Well, good morning, Robin, and good morning, everyone. I think in listening to those answers a moment ago, what I personally heard was a plea for what is missing and has been missing for some time from international relations and from individual nation-state governments. And every one of those suggestions that were made touch upon something we would wish to see among those who govern us and are not seeing among them at this present time. Now, as far as the international-based system is concerned, it's very out of date now. I mean, it was essentially established immediately after the Second World War in a world immeasurably different from the one that exists at the present time. Those people who were the greatest powers in the world at that time are not necessarily so today. There are other powers that have arisen that really ought to be right at the head of the international-based system, whether we're talking of the permanent membership of the United Nations, or whether perhaps we're talking of the inadequate way in which the World Trade Organization is working at the moment, as it's undermined separately both by the United States and by China. So do I think the Western-led international-based system is under strain? Yes, I do. Do I think it will be reformed in the short term? I think that it should, but I'm not convinced that it will be, because I see no individual international leader who's going to press for that with the authority to bring people together to redesign the rules for this century rather than continuing to live. So I think it ought to be changed. It desperately needs to be changed, but I suspect that sloth will leave it as it is for some time.
And when you say sloth will leave it as it is, do you think it can cope in that case, or do you feel that in a way it will crumble apart and we're going to be left in the kind of much more punchy world that we remember from 100 years ago?
It's in disrepair.
Yeah.
I mean, if you take, well, I'll take the two I mentioned. Let me start with the World Trade Organization. At the moment, their dispute resolution system is about to cease to operate. They need at least 5 judges to do that. They've lost 3 of them. America is blocking their reappointment. Another one leaves later on this year. There will be 1 judge to deal with dispute resolution for trade issues all the way around the world. Now, that is absolutely and completely absurd. Here we are on the, well, at the beginning, perhaps, who can tell, of a really serious trade dispute between the United States and China. Both of them have a disregard for the WTO in their different ways, and there is no dispute resolution mechanism that will be available without the judges being reappointed. I cannot think of anything more stupid or more damaging to the international system. And then you take the United Nations. We have a permanent 5 in the United Nations, but they no longer, there are several things wrong with that. Firstly, they no longer represent the real power structures around the world. And secondly, it leaves the United Nations with a single nation veto. And I think they would be very wise to revise the way in which the UN operates. I personally would like to see a much larger permanent membership of the UN, bringing in other countries that are very powerful today and were not so powerful in 1946. And I would also like to see the abolition of a single nation veto, and we have a larger veto. I think once that happens, nations further down the power pecking order, I think would feel that the UN represented their interests rather more than the national self-interested interests of the present 5 permanent members. And in a proper rules-based system in our modern world, we would reform this ancient series of arrangements we've got and bring it up to date. But that requires someone to take the lead, and I do not immediately see on the international horizon who is likely to do that.
I mean, part of the reason, and a very interesting point you made there, and I think something we may want to come back to either in our respective areas of work or specifically in this conference, this idea of maybe getting rid of the single nation veto, which I think, if I interpret you right, meant there could be some type of veto system, but not of one nation. But it does bring us to the second part of the question, which is the big powers that we're back at. I had the great pleasure of chairing a small dinner yesterday evening at Chatham House that marked in essence 100 years since the dinner in Paris that led to the founding of Chatham House and the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, part of the Versailles Peace Treaty negotiations. In any case, we had a little dinner. Now, one of the issues that came up at that dinner was the very great fear amongst a number of the participants that the United States and China are almost destined to end up in confrontation, perhaps precisely because of the reason you said, there is no structure out there that is containing a rising element of insecurity and frustration between the two. Where do you sit in that spectrum of mild concern to being very deeply worried, and what can we do about it?
I think it depends on the timescale. I mean, I think the first point I would make about the rise of China is that economically, I think the rise of China has a great deal of merit for the whole world. If the United States were to go into recession and you have another giant the other side of the world, then I think you have a balance that you didn't have before. I can see a lot of advantage for the whole of Asia of the growth of China as an economic entity. But of course, you can't rise as an economic entity without rising as a political entity as well, and over time as a military entity. China is spending a great deal of money particularly on its naval capacity and on its sub-ocean capacity, certainly far more than it admits to in its budgets. And China is beginning to use its political and economic strength to gain its way in many parts of the world. And I think one has to look at that with a certain degree of concern. I think of the South China Sea, where undoubtedly they are behaving illegally. I think also, perhaps more contemporarily, what is happening in Hong Kong at the present time. Now, I used to work in Hong Kong way back in the dark ages, over 50 years ago. And I have been back to Hong Kong on a regular basis ever since. I know it reasonably well. I wouldn't claim to be an expert, but I know it reasonably well. And what we have seen after the handover in 1997 was a decade in which China behaved much better, I think, than almost anybody believed that they would. That is beginning to change. It's beginning to change with missing booksellers. It's beginning to change with not obeying the implicit but not explicit promise that Hong Kong could elect its own chief executive without interference from Beijing. It's beginning to change with the extent to which China is beginning to influence who can stand to be members of the Hong Kong legislature. And now, of course, they are proposing a law. Carrie Lam may have introduced it, but I don't have a shred of doubt that it was written and determined in Beijing, of a new law to enable people to be removed from Hong Kong to China to face trial. Now, there is an arguable case whether that is within or without the basic law, if I can be a pedantic lawyer for a moment. If what happened would be that individual cases were considered by the Hong Kong court and passed over to Beijing, you can make an arguable case that that falls within the basic law. I know of no one who believes that is what is going to happen or that that is what is intended. And yet there was a quite explicit promise that Hong Kong would have its own legal system quite distinct from Beijing. That is being fused. The firewall between China and Hong Kong in terms of the legal system is being broken down by this proposal, and that is very dangerous. It's very dangerous for two reasons. It's very dangerous in terms of human rights, because I know of no one outside China who believes their courts are independent and uninfluenced by the Chinese government. And it's also extremely dangerous for Hong Kong's business reputation. If people begin to believe that the law as interpreted in Hong Kong, whether for individuals or for business, is no longer the Hong Kong-based system, but is a system polluted by China, then you're going to do great damage to the business community in Hong Kong. And so I can understand why so many people are worried in Hong Kong about this particular move. During all the years, we were a wicked colonial power in Hong Kong. I do not recall 1 million people taking to the streets to object to anything that previous British governments have done. That is now happening, and I think it's very worrying. And it is indicative of the way China is beginning to flex its muscles in political, and who can tell in due course, military and policing ways, because of their growing economic authority.
Okay, we're sticking with this issue then for a second. That flexing of the muscles, which obviously is part of the issue that we're discussing here in the rules-based system, to what extent do you think it is principally around this region to do with China's internal security, and how much would you project this as something that's going out and influencing the way the world is governed internationally, whether the Belt and Road or some of these other big initiatives that are being undertaken? Do you see the international engagement through a relatively positive light, and you're worried about the sort of extension of the domestic sphere, or do you draw a distinction between these or not?
Nothing is ever as clear-cut as that. Yeah. Of course, the Belt and Road Initiative is portrayed as an economic advance, but it would be unrealistic not to accept that that is going to provide a great deal of additional political clout for China as well. So you can't divide those into little silos and say this is purely economic, this is purely political. Of course, they spill over one into the other. Politics isn't black and white. Politics is often, if I dare use the word, very grey. And it bleeds together. And that is certainly happening with almost everything that China does. It may not be intended malignly. That we don't yet know. But what we do know is that their growing economic power is magnifying their political power, and their economic power is financing a growing military capability. Now, beyond doubt, America and China are the two most powerful nations in the world and will be for the foreseeable future. For as far ahead as I can see, it'll certainly see me out and a lot of others too. And I don't know whether, implicit in your question, whether that comes to a military standoff at some stage in the future. It might well. I don't think that is imminent because China has too many internal problems, in my judgment, to look for external disputes with the United States. Although the dispute over trade, if not solved, may sour relationships. Though personally, I do think for their own reasons that President Xi and Trump will reach an accommodation on trade sometime later this year, well in advance of the presidential election in the United States, where a triumph can be declared, and well in advance of probably the end of the year in China, where President Xi can claim to have stood up to the imperialist power and gained a great deal. 2 triumphs will be declared.
Well, I was going to ask you whether you were confident about having the US, sort of countering China's rise and so on, but maybe we'll save that up for questions. I do want to pull off one other question that really came from your remarks about Hong Kong. Obviously, one of the guarantors, or the key guarantor of that basic law, that condition, is the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. I mean, it struck me as quite interesting that I haven't seen the UK's voice publicly, maybe I'm missing something here, quite as strong at the moment on it. The UK, as it heads towards probably, possibly Brexit, is going to find itself, is it not, somewhat caught between this triangle of the United States, of China, potentially of Europe, or certainly of its own responsibilities. Where do you think, how would you put the UK's role within Hong Kong, and how is it perhaps a symptom or metaphor of the kind of choices the UK will have to make after Brexit?
We don't have power in Hong Kong. We were a colonial power for a long time, but our lease ended, and legally, Hong Kong had to return to China. And in the early 1980s, Margaret Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe negotiated a new arrangement, and a basic law was established. Now, we cannot compel that to be honored, but we are in a position where we have a moral and, I think, a political obligation to Hong Kong to make it clear to the world, if we believe that what was agreed in the basic law and what was promised by China to the people of Hong Kong and the rest of the world is not being kept. I think we are in a position to raise our voice in the world about that. We may well, in the first instance, and I don't know this, I'm not in the government and I haven't been in Parliament for 18 years. We may well be doing things behind the scenes. We may well be making private approaches to China about this. And if we are, doing it that way rather than going public is probably the right way to proceed in the short term. But the direct answer to your question is yes, we do have a moral obligation to speak out if we think things are not being handled correctly. And some members of people who were in my government some years ago are doing so. Chris Patten has, Malcolm Rifkind has, it may be that other people have as well.
And for the United Kingdom more broadly, because this is, I think, one of the themes we wanted to touch on, especially with your experience here, as you look ahead, Brexit Britain, it is one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. It is one of the big drafters, champions of international law. How do you see Britain's role in this more competitive world, given the context of Brexit? I mean, I'm sure you... I'll pose it to you broadly that way. We can be more specific in a minute.
Yes, I think I know where you're going.
I think I know where you're coming from.
I think some instinct tells me. I think a lot will depend on in the future on what happens post-Brexit. Are we going to have an internationally respected Prime Minister who will look outwards to the world and not inwards to his or her navel, or are we not? That will make a material difference. We do need an internationally respected leader if we are to raise our voice without the bulwark on one side of the European Union that we've had, and on the other side, the United States, which has always been seen as a great ally of the United Kingdom, still is and will be, but of course is looking more to the Pacific than to Europe and the UK. So whereas we would march out in the world with these two great powers, Europe on one hand and America on the others, subliminally beside us when we made political or diplomatic approaches, in future we will not have that in the way that we did, and we will be correspondingly diminished because we have left the European Union. That has, is, and always will be my position until it is proved to be something different, and I don't think it will be proved to be different. So the influence of Britain will depend to a large extent on how we are perceived by the rest of the world. And since in politics these days that tends to narrow down to a very small number of people, and most obviously the leader of a country, a lot will depend on who is the Prime Minister, whether it is a figure that is going to be internationally respected, or whether it is someone that the world will regard as the mouthpiece of a particular faction.
Do you think that the UK, which has been such a champion of rules-based order, not just externally, but through almost its non-constitutional constitution domestically, that kind of accountability, which is such an important element of governance, for many people looking at the UK from outside, the post-referendum period looks particularly chaotic. It's almost like a loss of accountability, a referendum that wasn't quite at least prepared for in terms of the result. Are you concerned about the governance structures within the United Kingdom itself, whether we have parties and leaders that are capable of stepping up to the international challenges outside by also being particularly strong and accountable at home. One of the questions we heard was transparency, accountability. Do you feel we're getting that inside the UK as well at the moment?
I have studiously avoided invitations from the media over the last 6 months on a daily basis to actually comment on questions like that. But I suppose I was going to be cornered one day. When a government doesn't have a majority, it is infinitely weakened. It is weakened in a wide variety of ways. When a government not only doesn't have a majority, but is itself significantly split in policy, then its international influence is weakened even further. That is not a particular weakness in the Prime Minister. It is an endemic weakness, because you're not in a position to carry your business in the way that you would be if you had a majority of 50, 80, or 100 in the House of Commons. There are related questions to this. One of the things I have learned in the last 40 years of traveling around the world pretty regularly, and especially in the last 20 years, is the remarkable respect there is around the world, respect and admiration for the British parliamentary system. It is seen as being very different from most other parliamentary systems, and we have gained as a nation a very great deal from that reality. If people start threatening that or tampering that, we are in difficulties. And I will be quite blunt now. When you get to the situation that you have people suggesting that we prorogue Parliament because Parliament may take a different view from a particular faction in the House of Commons, then you are heading in a very dangerous territory. If I look back through British history, I cannot imagine Mr. Disraeli, Mr. Gladstone, Mr. Churchill, or Mrs. Thatcher, even in their most difficult moments, saying, let us put Parliament aside while I carry through this difficult policy that a part of my party disagrees with. It is fundamentally unconstitutional. And to hear that argument come from people who in the Brexit debate talked about the sovereignty of Parliament being at stake, it is not only fundamentally distasteful, it is hypocrisy on a gold-plated standard. Now, I don't think that that can possibly be allowed to stand. I don't think the House of Commons will allow it to stand. And to be absolutely frank, I don't think anybody who proposes that, or even lets it flit through their mind for a second, has any understanding of what Parliament is about, what sovereignty is about, what leadership is about, or what the United Kingdom is about. And the sooner the House of Commons stamp on this idea, absolutely comprehensively and forever, the better.
Well, that was a clear answer. But Chatham House meetings, I rarely get clear answers as good as that one. It was a very clear answer. So, John, thank you for explaining your thoughts. Now, I do want to draw out. We've got 15, 20 minutes left. We've got a lot of people here. We have a chance to go in many directions. We can go in the direction of the big global governance questions we talked about at the beginning. We can head, obviously, in some UK directions if you wish as well. So please catch my eye. I'll probably take one at a time, but I'll see I may group as we go along. First person to catch my eye here, please. And please introduce yourselves if you don't mind. And I've got two here.
Thank you. Good morning to all. My name is Euripides, High Commissioner of Cyprus. Thank you, Sir John. Always brilliant and insightful. Yes, the rule-based international system is outdated. It needs reform. You do not see a leader that is probably going to push that. Yet at the same time, my question, and I'm sorry for the simplicity of my question, don't you think that the more things change and the more things need to be changed, that we should really be keeping our eyes on the basics, transparency, accountability, democracy, rule of law, all these things that have been said, and how do we go about doing that at the international level, local level, which can also fit at the international level, but at the international level, because it seems that the more things change, and the more the need is for them to remain the same in a modern and reinvention, of course. Thank you.
Do you want me to gather two or three questions, or would you like to take that one first?
No, I'll take that one first. I remember when I was a very young man reading a financial reporter called Patrick Hutber. Some of the more vintage among you may remember him. And he had a slogan, "Improvement means deterioration." And in many ways, that is true. And when Euripides asked his question, that sprung into my mind. If we're going to deal with the problems that underlie your question, we are not only going to have to make reforms, we're going to have to look as we do so at the particular interests of developing countries, and countries that because of their size or wealth do not have any particular power in the world. Unless that happens, the rules-based system is not fair. It ought to be as fair to the Faroe Islands as it is to the United States or China. And we have to move in that direction. Now, how do we get there? I actually think a great deal of this is not something you can impose by statute. It is something that comes from example. And if the large nations of the world are prepared to set an example of equity and fairness in the way in which they operate and establish the rules-based system, then it will be followed. If they act as rogue states, then others will be disillusioned and will act as rogue states as well, or will just shrug their shoulders if they have no power and move away and resent the fact the way the system is working. So I think a great deal does depend. I notice in a sense this is a non-answer, because it is a mistake, if I may say so, to believe that for every problem there is a solution. My experience as Prime Minister is that for every solution there is another problem. And this is probably true here. But the example of the big states in the world carries a long way, even if there are one or two rogues among them.
Thank you very much. Please, gentleman here, lady there. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Stian Christensen. I'm with the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for very insightful remarks, John. I just caught my attention, your remark about the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO and the crisis that it is in. And this is obviously very serious, and it's a praiseworthy mechanism in all respects except one, and that is the following. Out of the first 500 cases of the DSM, only one was actually initiated by one of the the least developed countries or other low-income countries on the OECD list, meaning that most of the world is actually not really a part of this mechanism. And even in all its fairness and equity, when it actually handles disputes, really a lot of the world is not having a stake in that part of the international trade system. So really the question is, how can we hope to improve or even defend the present rules-based order if many of the countries that are actually part of it don't really have a stake in it? How can we ensure that these countries actually have the equity and fairness that you so warmly speak about? Thank you very much.
Well, you reinforce the fact that it is out of date and it needs renegotiation in order to bring it up to date. Now, I can't see anyone who is going to convene the sort of approach we need. Frankly, the only person who can do it is with the real power to do it would probably be the President of the United States. So it's conceivable the European Union collectively might be able to do it, to bring people together, to negotiate what an equitable system would look like, and then seek to persuade sufficient people to come together to redesign the rules of the World Trade Organization. But that is rather a limited ambition. The truth is that almost every one of the post-war settlements is out of date, whether it's the individual shares in the World Bank, whether it's the permanent membership of the UN, whether it's an outdated system in the World Trade Organization, whatever it might be. And that does need nationalism to be in retreat and internationalism to begin to enforce its authority again. Now, I make no secret of the fact that in the connected world we live in the globalized world we live in, I think if we do not make a success of internationalism and we begin breaking ourselves up into individual, self-interested, navel-gazing, selfish little countries, then we are going to find that we are all the losers over a period of time. But we do need someone big enough and powerful enough to stand up and say that, and then to bring people together to see what we can do. So it is for the powerful people in the nation, in the world, to begin talking about how out of date our systems are and how desirable it would be to bring them more up to date. It will never be perfect. We don't live in a world in which perfect has any real meaning. There'll be areas that aren't very good, but it can be immeasurably better than we have now, providing we have the leaders and the will to bring people together and make it so.
Thank you very much. I've got lots of hands, so I apologize. I won't get to everyone, but lady here first. Going here and here. There was somebody.
Helena Wilkinson.
Hold the microphone close.
Sorry, Helena Wilkinson, BBC News. Sir John, would Boris Johnson make a good Prime Minister?
You set yourself up.
And just a second question, follow up to that. Would you be happy should he take the UK out of the EU on October the 31st if he was to become the Prime Minister?
Well, I don't think it is credible to take us out of the European Union on the 31st of October. I don't frankly see how it can be done. I think those people who are suggesting that it can be done, and it isn't only Boris Johnson, have their fingers crossed behind their back. They're whistling gently into the wind, and they're hoping that some miracle might happen where it might actually be possible. I don't think it is possible. And I think it's another area of disillusion for people will lie ahead when they realize that what is being said to them is not actually going to be deliverable. As to your first question, you must draw your own conclusion. It's a secret ballot.
Right. Right at the front row, please, here. And then I'm going to the lady there. I'm going here, I'm going here. I'll get somebody at the back. Yep.
Thank you. Sir John, Michael Fullilove from the Lowy Institute in Australia. Can I ask you a question?
I'd never have guessed.
No jokes about cricket and the rules-based order, please. Can I ask you a question as a former practicing politician and indeed a leader of a Western government? You alluded earlier to the fact that there's not enough leadership to drive the changes that would make the international order fairer and more equal. But can I sharpen it slightly and go further than that and say that it's hard to think of a time when there have been so few Western leaders of strength and vision. And I don't think I'm just being nostalgic. We live at a time when the leader of the free world doesn't believe in the free world, when Britain has decided to weaken itself and weaken Europe and weaken the West, and the British Prime Minister has reaped the whirlwind because of that. Mrs. Merkel is exiting stage left. There are very few strong, capable Western leaders around the world. Is that fair, do you think? And if it is fair, why has it happened now? How would you explain it?
I'm just looking across the world at those strong vision-led leaders in Australia that you might have had recently to see what lessons we can actually learn from that. I think to an extent you have to consider the times in which we live. No previous leaders have had to live in the age of social media. I think that has made a much bigger difference, even in the 20-odd years since I was effectively in politics, or the 25 years since I was in government. The world has changed dramatically, and it has become, if I may be fair to politicians for a while, it has become immeasurably more difficult to lead. When you propose something, and before it has even been considered, it is denounced by huge numbers of people who have not examined the problem, do not understand the problem, do not care what it will lead to in 5 or 10 years' time. And it does place parliamentary leaders in a more difficult position. And that in itself has tended to lead to fragmented governments without the majority to do things. So there is a connection here. It isn't innately that the prime ministers and presidents of nations are innately less able than those 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. It is to a large extent that they are operating in a much more difficult environment. I wonder how some of the titans of European politics in the past 200 years would have been seen in today's world with today's social media and with today's public attitudes. I think it is extremely difficult. So I don't wish to take the old politician's trick of saying it was all much better in the past and it's all gone to hell in a handcart now. I do think they're living in a different set of circumstances, and it may change. Nothing is forever. You do get cycles in politics. Public moods change, public demands change. And when that happens, you may find that politicians have an authority with the public will behind them that they do not have when the public will is basically opposed to them. This populist surge that we've had is immensely damaging to good government, in my judgment. The thing about populism is that it is popular until it is carried out, and then it is seen for what it is, an undeliverable, empty promise of no use to anyone except the person who used the promise in order to get themselves to a particular position. That will go away, it will be exposed, and then we'll move to a different situation, and you may be confronting some political giants yet again. I certainly hope so.
I've got a lot of hands. And what I think, if you don't mind, Sir John, as part of the idea is to try and get viewpoints in. I will collect some, and I've got a pen, and I will feed them back to you, if you see what I'm saying. And you may pick, and you may not be able to take them all, but I do want people to feel they had a chance to say what they had in mind. There's a lady been waiting very patiently right here in the middle.
Hello, Judith McGregor, former High Commissioner in South Africa. Building on the last question, Sir John, I mean, the fact is that there has been really a growing sense of indifference, one could say popularly, towards the international rules-based system. And the populist leaders have been democratically elected. So going forwards, to try and get some kind of backing behind leaders to enable them to take forward, to counter things like China's disregard for many of the rules of the game, which haven't been possible till now, do you see perhaps some light in issues such as climate change or sustainability, where there really does seem to be interest and real, sort of engagement amongst people, and we're always being told it can't be handled by ourselves alone? I mean, perhaps we need to just change the sort of timbre of the debate and move away from the institutions, keeping them in our minds in order, but through the issues that really do grab people.
I think I'll take that one straight away.
Quick answers, yeah, please.
I think that's very important. I mean, what I think you have seen with climate change is a demand bubbling up from the grassroots, from everyday people, on such a scale that the politicians are finding it impossible to ignore it. And I think in the issue of climate change, I think that is extremely welcome that they do so. There is a problem in that some countries, China, are actually moving towards climate change action rather well. I was critical of them earlier. I should mention that they're doing that. Other nations are not. But I think if there is a public will in those countries, it will change. The other point that I think is relevant to what you're saying is to ask a question. How often have you heard in the last 10 or 15 years any senior government figures in almost any country talk about what we need to do today to safeguard the position of the next generation in 25 or 50 years' time? And you don't hear it. You don't hear it. Those voices are not being raised. Horizons are shortening because of populism and for a raft of other reasons as well. And yet I don't believe human nature has changed. I think if many politicians were to stand up and say, we have to tackle these problems because they are going to materially damage the life chances of our children and our grandchildren, and we must make sacrifices now in order to ensure their future. Now, I think that appeal, carried with details on health or in anything else, would have a very fair hearing in almost every democratic country I can think of. And if I might give you one illustration in the field of health, I'll see if I can remember the statistics. For every person today in the UK who is retired, there are 15 people in work paying taxes to help pay for the National Health Service and the caring services that we need. Sorry, that was so in 2000. Yeah. Today, there are 7 people, not 15. And by 2000, when our grandchildren will still be alive, and some of our children may still be alive, the ratio will be 2 to 1, not 15 to 1, which it was in 2000. So that is a problem that in terms of paying for it is absolutely extraordinary. And unless we start making provision now, or within the next few years, we are going to hand on a problem to our own children and our own grandchildren that it will be too late to solve in any acceptable way. Now, I think if you began to present, I can only speak for the British public, but if you began to present the British public in a clear, understandable way, with the sort of problems like that that lay ahead, and many of them are much nearer, then I think they would respond. A second example, if I can just give it, how many care workers do you think we need every day to make sure we have sufficient by 2030 for the elderly people who are likely to be in care? The answer is about 200. Are we going to get that from the British nation alone, or are we going to need help from our neighbours in terms of migration? I suggest the latter is the case. So there are a whole series of things. I won't bore you with others now, but the long term is the responsibility of today, and tomorrow will curse us if we don't begin to make provision for it.
Very important points. I'm glad you're able to make them. And I might just warn my colleagues, we might take 2 or 3 minutes off the next panel, the start of the next panel, just to be able to, as I've nodded at least 5 people. So I'm going to let maybe some of them come in, but please ask you to be very quick. Just make a statement or a question, and I'm going to group them all. And Sir John will answer what he wants to and what he doesn't, but I don't want to miss the opportunity. First here, then there, then there, then there. Yeah, sorry, that side of the room. I've been looking this way too much. Yep.
Yes, Dekai, I'm a professor of artificial intelligence at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I've been, thank you, Sir John, for your comments. I've been witnessing Hong Kong's history and development for 28 years now. With respect to what's happening in Hong Kong and the extradition law, we have inherited, fortunately, the British judiciary system, and to the theme of rule-based orders, that is what you rely on to implement the rules. Should the discussion about what is happening in Hong Kong now, since they are the ones to decide under the proposed extradition scheme, should the discussion not be focused on how to maintain the functioning of the independent judiciary?
Right. So
I can answer that straight away, yes. Right.
Should be focused on the independent judiciary. Yep.
Yep.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes.
Right at the back. Right there. Then coming down here.
Mark Stope from Scenario Summit. This is a bit of a teaser to the simulation war games that people can still sign up for. Let's say it's the Chatham House 11, 5 years ahead. Let's say that Trump has again been voted and we're 2024. How do you, sir, see the world of 2024 with everything we're discussing here today? What is your opinion on that?
Okay, hold on. What's the world look like in 2024? Definitely hold that one. Here.
I just want to take you back to the Cold War we're talking about today, or the new Cold War, which has the assumption that one side will fold. And I think when it comes to China and America, especially when it comes to digital supremacy, no side will fold. And so in that context, does Europe once again have a role to play in a future rules-based order if it brings in swing players in that digital war that don't want the hegemony between the two, maybe on an ethics approach as well in terms of digital supremacy?
Can I take that straight away?
Take that straight away?
Yes. The answer is yes. One of the problems with Britain leaving Europe is not only that it is going to affect Britain, but that it is going to weaken Europe. It weakens Europe in many ways. They lose the second largest economy, one of only 2 nations with a significant military capacity, longest foreign policy reach anywhere, and that is a weakness. And so instead of there being 3 broadly equal massive economies in the world, the European, the Chinese, and the American, Europe begins to fall behind. That is not an attractive option when the cradle of democracy falls behind a non-democratic China, and frankly, at the moment, a slightly rackety United States.
Right. 1, 2, 3, and we're closing. I'm sorry, I've got to go with the ones I saw. Yep.
I'm Shao from China. I just want to know that according to your rationale, you talk about South China Sea, Hong Kong, China, BRI, etc. Do you think that Britain and other countries should return to the gunboat diplomacy as you did during the Opium War?
We don't have the gunboats.
Don't have the gunboats anymore. That might be your answer. Let me just get a couple more and then you can close. Robert, yep. And then here. Microphone coming, microphone coming. Well, no one will hear you otherwise. Yep.
Robert Cooper used to work for British government and European Union. On your remarks in social media, it sounded as though what you were describing was a crisis in legitimacy of government itself worldwide. Well, that's quite a profound thought. We had them before, 1830s, 1930s. So come on, 2030s.
So, something to keep in mind. Last comment here. Sorry. I've got to be gender equal. I'm going to get one lady in. Yep.
So John Kayo Kochweser from the Bretton Woods system, 75 years old, not fit for the next 75 years. Some of us former finance officials proposed to do a mini Bretton Woods, starting practically with the multilateral development banks, of which are now many, including the China-created one, division of labor, global public goods, election of leadership, representation. The German G20 presidency picked this up and had an eminent persons group led by Deputy Prime Minister Tharman from Singapore, but it was not bold enough addressing these more fundamental government issues. What is your view on Bretton Woods reform?
Just pass my microphone to the lady behind you because we're a gender equal conference, but I'm trying to get the questions the same way. Yeah.
Denisa Zarelic in Herzegovina. I just want to agree with you that the British UK has been seen, or the parliamentary politics admired abroad, but so has been the consensual political culture. And as you said, this has served as an example internationally, but do you think that the more divisive political culture in Britain is now serving as a bad example, and how permanent is the damage?
Right. So John, what do you want to take there
Remind
to close
me.
up with? So divisive political culture, we had gunboats, and we have the world in 2024, I think are the main things, but go on, yeah.
I think it is divisive, and I regret that. I won't enlarge on it through time. I never disagree with Robert Cooper, I know my place. As for Bretton Woods, I entirely agree with you that we need a complete reform. As to what the world is going to look like in 10 years, I'd be rather happy to know what it would look like in 10 days in the present moment. And I'm afraid if I answered your 10-year question, we would still be here till lunchtime. So I hope you will forgive me if I don't. One of the delights of no longer being in politics is you don't always have to answer the question. Whereas in politics, as you know, politicians always answer the question absolutely, completely.
Before we thank Sir John, let me just say two quick things. Number one, my colleagues at Chatham House over the last couple of months have been beavering away to put together a collection of ideas and essays curated by Adam Ward, our Deputy Director. There is a sort of modernizing the rules-based international order online. 200 hard copies somewhere, my colleagues will show you where, but do pick them up if you want to see ideas right from antimicrobial resistance and the splinter net to more traditional things around WTO and the future of the Bretton Woods institutions. So I want to do a call out for that. In a second, please stay in your seats because I'm going to invite Ritala Shah up to moderate our first full plenary with a super cast sitting there. I'm not going to call them out. I'm delighted they're all with us. But what I do want to do is thank you all for being here this morning. Great questions and a very big hand for our President of Chatham House, Sir John Major.
Thank you very much. Thank you.